Poem to my darling birdie. Who is it that hath burst the door, unclosed the heart that shuts before, and set her queen-like on its throne, and made its homage all her own? My birdie. Poetry from one heart to another. A lover to their partner, perhaps. Well, kind of. Sort of. Holding your hand was a marvellous experience. The way our fingertips gently pressed each other's, and how our hands cuddled around one another's so softly. It was when I was holding your hand that I knew you have awakened the dormant part of my soul. A letter back from one lover to another. Words written from a man to a woman, from a woman to a man, full of hope, full of love, but perhaps full of something else. Plans. Poison. Just how do you solve this mystery? How do we answer the questions of why and if and how she did what she did, if she did what she did? Does anyone really know? Welcome to Extraordinary Stories podcast. Hey, how are you? Are you well? Are you good? I am. Alright, thank you very much for those who got in touch about the last episode. Yeah, lots of lovely comments, so thank you. Okay, I've got another story for you here, and it's a mystery. A right mystery, so get your mystery ears on. Get listening. And I can't wait to hear what you think. Alright, you bunch of foxy devils. Are you ready? Okay, let's go. Being born illegitimately was not okay in 1855. And so when Clara Chamberlain announced to her husband Adolphe that she was pregnant, this was trouble. Why? They were married, I hear you ask. Yeah, they were married, but the baby that Clara was carrying was not her husband's. Clara and Adolphe were a sexless couple. Actual historical term, I didn't just make that up. Sexless couple. And this is important because this concept of couples who don't engage in the horizontal tango will come up. They weren't shagging, basically. And this had been a part of their agreement of their marriage. Not sure why couples at the time did this, but Clara and Adolphe did. Fine, hey, you just live your life, be free, you do you. Yeah? So, being pregnant, well, this was trouble. Now, it's believed that Clara had fallen for a well-to-do Englishman. And that's important because Clara and Adolphe were French. They lived in France. And some exotic Englishman had swept into town, got Clara pregnant, and now she was with child. So the couple, really fearing that they were going to be kicked out of their church, agree that they're just going to keep this a secret. They're going to keep this as much of a secret as they possibly can, and that they will pass this child off as their own. And they do. They have a daughter. They call her Adelaide. And they raise her in France. So all good for the first few years until Adelaide is 6. Her father starts to become unwell, and within 2 months he dies, followed shortly by her mother, leaving Adelaide an orphan. So completely alone in the world, she is taken in. She's raised by a couple called William Wellbeloved and his wife Anne Wellbeloved. What a surname! Oh, I'm all about that. Barry Wellbeloved. Nah, it doesn't really work. So they take Adelaide in at 6 and they raise her right through until she's an adult. So when she's 19, William, her adopted father, turns to her and he says, Adelaide, it's time to think about marriage. And I've got just the perfect plan. And the plan is this. He will arrange the marriage. He will pay the man who takes Adelaide from him a very large amount of money for doing so. And within his plan, Adelaide won't have any say in who this is or where this is going to happen. And so an arrangement is made between Adelaide's father and the man who will be her husband. They sit down and they hash out the ground rules. I mean, gutted, right? If you're 19-year-old Adelaide, you've got your life ahead of you, and you've got all your choices, and then your dad and some guy you don't even know are planning your life for you. So her dad picks an Englishman living in London called Edwin Bartlett. First thing to point out, Edwin is 30 years old. He is 11 years older than Adelaide. I mean, not terribly uncommon at the time for there to be an age gap. You know, often older men marrying younger women. We're wandering into a whole thing here about, you know, women having to be looked after. Men had these roles to protect and to educate, blah, blah, blah. All of that nonsense. Anyway, those were the beliefs of the time, and this is the situation. So Edwin, that Adelaide's going to be married to, what's he all about? Well, Edwin is a grocer, and he owns a series of small groceries in London. He's of kind of modest wealth, I guess, is how a historian might describe it. And he's a bachelor. So William, the father, Edwin, the husband-to-be, they sit down and they discuss a few arrangements. First of all, Edwin will have to take care of Adelaide's education. He will have to see that she attends school. Secondly, he has to agree to taking complete responsibility for her, and anything financial, he has to take that on. And third, and this is the most important one to the father, he must never mention that Adelaide was born through illegitimate means or raised by people who weren't her flesh and blood. So Edwin agrees to all of this. And before you know what's happening, Adelaide is shipped off to England. Her and Edwin marry, and before you can say boo to a goose, Adelaide is shipped off to a boarding school, now a married woman. I mean, it's all a bit fast, isn't it? See ya. Later's Adelaide. I know you've just married this complete stranger that you've never met, but actually you're off to study in Belgium for 2 years. How odd. Anyway, off she goes for 2 years to study, and Edwin, he's in London waiting for her to return. And when she comes back, they embark on their married life. So that's the setup, right? That's how we get to the here bit of the story. And it's what happens next that will mean that Adelaide Bartlett's name goes down in the history books, and that she will become a figure of mystery and speculation. In discussing the boundaries of their marriage, it was agreed by Adelaide and Edwin that they wouldn't have sex. That was agreed by both parties. This new late 1800s fashion for couples to do the no pants dance just wasn't for them. This was agreed. So Adelaide would spend some of her days working bits and pieces in his grocery shops. She would continue to receive different tutors for her education. And in the first 5 years of their marriage, something happens to cause a right ruckus in the Bartlett family. Edwin has a younger brother called Frederick, and Frederick also lives in London. And on the days when Edwin was just too busy grocerying, being a businessman, to spend any time with his wife, she would seek out the company of Frederick, her husband's younger brother. And so they had time together. One thing led to another. And before you know it, Frederick and Adelaide are doing the old naked hokey cokey. So, this happens a few times. And when news of this, I don't know how it happens, but when news of this reaches the Bartlett family, this is major drama. Here was Adelaide, the young bride of the family, having relations with her husband's brother. And the claws really come out for Adelaide at this point. Suddenly, every family member is saying, well, I've never trusted her. I've always thought there was something suspicious about this one. And I tell you who was the most vocal in all of this. Edwin's father, Edwin Sr. He had never been happy about his son's arranged marriage to this French girl. And now, here he was with this promiscuous daughter-in-law, his family at each other's throats, and she's to blame. Now, both Frederick and Adelaide deny that an affair between them ever happened. But nobody's buying that. No one is believing that in the family. Especially not Edwin Sr. He's convinced this has happened. He believes it so much, he sends Frederick overseas to work. He's like, get out my sight, go and work in, I don't know, Germany. Get out my face. And he warns Edwin, he says, the woman you've married is trouble. She is going to bring you trouble. Now I think this is interesting. Edwin takes his wife's side in all of this. He says, if she's saying no affair happened, then I believe her. This is all a drama about nothing. And he battles with his own father about this. And in the end, Edwin says to his dad, I want you to make an apology to Adelaide for the things that you've said. And I want it in writing. I want you to actually write her a letter of apology. And he does, to keep the peace. Now, he's got no love for Adelaide, Edwin Sr., but he does have a lot of love for his son. So he will write this letter. We don't have a picture of Edwin Sr. which is annoying. But I'm imagining sort of big man, moustache, beard. Don't know why. For some reason, he's got a glass of whiskey and a really red face. That's what I'm imagining. Imagine him shaking his fist at having to write this letter. So once the letter's written and the apology's been made, the brother is overseas. That's it, put to bed. Edwin and Adelaide can carry on their lives. Let's talk a bit about Edwin. He was a man that people referred to as peculiar. Why? Well, it was said that he had just little odd ways about him. And generally people just found him, a bit odd. He'd some strange beliefs for the time. He'd once approached the local minister of where they lived, and he asked in confidence if it was possible for a man to have 2 wives. Now, no one's really sure why he asked this. And later, the minister would say, I was never clear if he meant, was it possible to have 2 wives in the marital bed? Or 1 wife in the marital bed and 1 wife for something else? The minister was never clear why Edwin had asked this. I mean, it was odd because they weren't a physical couple, as we know. Other things that made Edwin peculiar is that he believed in a form of medicine which was emerging at the time and to many, many people was very strange. So to talk about this, I'll introduce the first of 3 doctors who play a role in this story. The first is Dr. Franz Mesmer. Now, he was responsible, Franz Mesmer, for something called animal magnetism. It was a sort of medical phenomenon which relates to a very complicated theory, but I'll do my best to kind of break it down and give you some of the parts of it. We could be here for a week if I tried to explain the whole of it, but I'll give you the headlines. Firstly, this doctor, he believed that all things in the world, so animals, human beings, inanimate objects, all had a force within them, like a current of energy. And if you could harness that current of energy, then you could cure illness. Yeah, it's as simple as that and as complicated as that, all at the same time. Another of his beliefs was that animals had a special mysterious fluid running through their system, and if you could extract this from animals and give it to humans, they would be cured of whatever it was that was wrong. I mean, I don't really fancy going to the doctor, I don't know, with like a sore finger, and the doctor being like, well, that's no bother, excuse me, let me just extract something from this ox behind me and I'll make you drink it and you'll be right as rain. Anyway, the theory just became magnetism after a while. It dropped the animal bit of it, and it was getting some interest from the medical community. People were paying attention to this. This doctor, he would cure women of their hysteria at the time by giving them this mysterious fluid that he got from animals and then attaching magnets to their body. And they reported at the time that they felt a strange fluid running through them and that they were cured. He reportedly cured a blind woman using magnets. So another thing that this doctor really believed in at the time was called forced sleep, but of course we would know it now as hypnotism. He was kind of the father of hypnotism. So if all of that sounds a bit confusing, it's because it was, and the theories are really hard to pin down, and what are they and what was it actually about. But all we need to know really is that Edwin Bartlett was a fan of these theories. He believed in them, and people would call him weird when he told people about them, and he said that he, believed in them. So here we've got Edwin, we've got Adelaide. And after 6 years of marriage, 2 major events will happen for this couple. The first is that Adelaide falls pregnant. How, I hear you ask? Well, her and Edwin have broken their no sex rule, and Adelaide has ended up pregnant. They've just had sex once, and this has happened. Now, she's always wanted to have children, so she's delighted. Edwin maybe less so, because he was quite happy with their life. Anyway, tragedy is about to strike. During labour, the 25-year-old Adelaide begins to bleed heavily and show signs of being in extreme pain. She's screaming in agony, and the midwife says to Edwin, "I'm going to have to call a doctor." And he says, absolutely no way. No way will a male doctor be involving himself with my wife right now. And the midwife tries to say to him, Edwin, there's no time for that kind of thinking or that kind of attitude. Your wife is in a really difficult labour here and we need a doctor. By the time they manage to track down a female doctor to attend Adelaide, it's too late. The baby is born, stillborn. And Adelaide is devastated. After this, Adelaide and Edwin make a deal that they would never have sex again, and that any future children were off the table, not to be considered. So that was event 1. Event 2 is that Edwin Sr., Edwin's father, comes to live with the couple. Awkward. He doesn't like Adelaide, as we know, but he does like his son. Basically what had happened is that Edwin's mother had died, and Edwin Sr. wanted to move out of the house, and he chose to come and live with his son and his daughter-in-law. Edwin's mother, by the way, just on a side note, is completely written out of this story. So interesting. So interesting. I mean, I know I kind of mentioned this before, but women at the time just being written out of history, it's absolutely mental. Anyway, she's never mentioned until she dies, but anyway, there you go. So here we are, we've got Edwin Sr. coming to live with Edwin and Adelaide, and it's all fine, it's okay. What they say to Edwin Sr. is, "You are welcome to stay as long as you need. That can be forever, if it needs to be. We are happy to have you. You're the best guest ever. Love having you here." And then they decide to move house and not take Edwin Sr. with them. Rude. Just plain rude. You can't be like, "Oh, it's so brilliant having you here, you could stay with us forever," and then decide you're going to downsize your house and he just has to figure out that he can't move with you. That's what's awkward about this, is they never tell him. They never say to Edwin Sr., "Oh, by the way, we're moving and we don't have enough bedrooms for you." They just move and he has to sort himself out. So between the horrible death of their baby, having their father-in-law living with them, what Edwin and Adelaide are looking for is a fresh start. They just want away from their house. So they move to Wimbledon in London, home of the tennis, and they set up home. Edwin's grocery business by this point is going really well. He's got about 16 shops, so they can well afford to move house and to live well. So we can agree it's been bumpy up to this point in their marriage, but now here comes a bit of peace. Or so it would seem. Within weeks of being in Wimbledon, they meet with their local minister, one George Dyson. George Dyson is 27 years old. So he's around about the same age as Adelaide, younger than Edwin. And the three of them hit it off. The three of them have a great old time when they are together. Minister Dyson is around once a week for dinner. He's always giving Adelaide bits of reading to do here and there. And the three of them, they just enjoy each other's company, and very quickly they become inseparable. The minister and the married couple become something of, well, I guess these days we'd call it a throuple. A couple but with three people in it. And that is essentially what they are. Now, how does that come about? Well, let me tell you. Adelaide is very excited by Minister Dyson and his teaching. And Edwin begins to wonder, does his wife have something of a fancy for the minister? And when he asks her, she denies it. She says no, but I do find myself drawn to thinking about him a lot and thinking about the things that he teaches me. Fine. So she's developed these kind of feelings for Dyson. And at the same time, Edwin, when he's not with the minister, is writing him letters telling him basically what a wonderful human being he is, and just how glad he is that Dyson has come in to their lives. So the three of them make this agreement that they're going to be this threesome, for want of a better word, for want of a better way to put it. Dyson is well aware of the no sex rule in the couple's marriage, and what went on behind closed doors between the three of them, we don't know. All I can think of when I'm talking about this is that really, do you remember the really shocking Princess Diana interview that she did years ago, and there was that line that she did, and it became so famous when she went, "There were three people in this marriage." Oh no, that was a rubbish Princess Diana. Let me try again. "There were three people in this marriage." No, that was even worse. But you get the point of what I'm saying. Yeah, that's kind of what it's like. Well, it's not really what it was like, because actually Princess Diana didn't know. No, I'm not getting into a whole Camilla Charles Diana debacle. You get the point. So it carries on like this. Dinners together during the days when Edwin is busy with his grocer business. Dyson would be round at the house tutoring Adelaide. He had a nickname for her, and that was Birdie. So that poem in the beginning was Dyson to Adelaide, and he wrote, "Who is it that hath burst the door, unclosed the heart that shuts before, and set her queen-like on its throne, and made its homage all her own? My Birdie." Well, I hope he was making loads of money out of being a minister, because he's not much of a poet. I could write better than that. So anyway, they would write this poetry to each other, and they had a really strong bond. Now, according to what we're going to hear later, it's believed that Edwin, and I'm quoting here, had given Adelaide to Dyson, and that he saw Dyson as a co-husband. There were three people in this marriage. That was better. Nailed it. And Edwin even went to these lengths to show how serious he was about this. He changed his will. So in these times, in the late 1800s, a man could write into his will that his wife were to get all of his money, belongings, property, etc. if he died, on the one condition that she never remarried. And that's what Edwin had written, until Dyson comes into their life and he changes it. He writes that his wife is allowed to remarry, and that should he die, he would be extremely happy if Dyson was to marry Adelaide. So why did Edwin feel so strongly about this? Well, I think the answer might lie in that Edwin was suffering from what was called internal problems. And what that meant was internal physical problems. So he had stomach complaints. He had these bouts of time when he would have to go to bed. He would get really dizzy, chronic cramps in his stomach. And these internal problems, they caused everyone a lot of worry. He'd once confided in Adelaide that he wouldn't last much more than a year. Now, a friend of his that he had through his businesses convinced Edwin that he should see a dentist because Edwin had very bad teeth. I mean, really bad. His whole mouth was just full of rotted teeth, basically. So enter the second doctor into the story, and I warn you now, if you're squeamish about dentistry, this is not the description for you. Dr. Leach, the dentist, took one look in Edwin's mouth and decided he needed to saw Edwin's teeth down to the stumps. So he did. He sawed Edwin's teeth down to the gum line. Gross. Absolutely gross. Believing this was what was causing these internal stomach problems. It was his rotting mouth. So after this, Edwin took to his bed for a long period of time. And the only thing that calmed him down was Adelaide sitting on the end of the bed holding his feet. That was the only thing that would get him to fall asleep. So now during this time, Edwin Sr., he starts to become really concerned about his son's health. And he calls Adelaide to tell her she must get another doctor involved. You know, his son is ill, something needs to be done, and she says to Edwin Sr., no, we simply can't afford it. Now that's nonsense, because they could afford it quite easily. So really angry at this, Edwin Sr. gets his arse in gear, he gets to London, and he demands to see his son. And he's furious when he sees how ill Edwin is. He really believes Adelaide isn't doing enough, and so he calls in our third doctor, Dr. Dudley. Dr. Dudley's a complete stranger to the family. Edwin Sr. has plucked him out of nowhere, basically. And Dr. Dudley takes a look at Edwin and he says, I think it's a combination of things. I think he's suffering from a bit of hysteria and he needs to get out in some fresh air. And he also says, I think the internal problem could be worms. Something is eating at Edwin's insides. Ugh, gross. And he questions if Edwin might have a venereal disease, syphilis, gonorrhea, but Edwin assures him this can't be the case because I don't have sex with my wife. Adelaide will say that during these times it's all that she can do to keep Edwin calm, that he spends most of his days lurking around the house. She describes him as pacing up and down like a ghost until she holds his feet in bed. That's the only time he's calm. So Minister Dyson is allowed to visit and see Edwin. Edwin Sr., he goes back home, but he says to Adelaide, you've really got to keep me up to date with what's happening with my son's health. And she writes letters almost daily. Now, a sceptical person might say that she was trying to keep Edwin Sr. away. See for yourself. She writes in this letter, Dear Father, the doctor was very angry that I had permitted Edwin to see his visitor, Mr. Dyson, last night, as it caused his head to be so bad. And he says no one is to be admitted unless he gives permission. Edwin is slightly better this morning. I will write to you every day and let you know how Edwin is. I can see myself how necessary it is that he should be kept calm. With love, yours, Adelaide. In other words, father-in-law, keep your big nose out of our lives. Now, it's interesting to note that she calls him dear father in that letter. He writes back and he says, I'm coming back again to visit. This time she responds with, Dear Mr. Bartlett. Change of tone. Dear Mr. Bartlett, Edwin is up. He seems to have withstood the teeth drawing very well. Please do not come all this distance. It is not right to have visitors in his sick room, and I don't feel that it is right to leave Edwin alone while I am writing to you downstairs, so I will keep this letter short. Adelaide. A very different tone from that first letter. So yeah, she's basically saying don't come here. Now, at the time, a very common medicine prescribed was chloroform. For illnesses where there wasn't a pill or a powder, doctors might prescribe in very, very small doses chloroform. It, could revive people's senses, get them back on their feet. Now, none of the doctors had actually prescribed this for Edwin, but Adelaide had. Thinking herself a bit of a Florence Nightingale, she asks Dyson, her co-husband, to go out into London and get her 4 small bottles of chloroform. But he must, she tells him, you must go to different pharmacies so as not to create suspicion from buying 4 bottles from one place. So Dyson asks what is it that she's planning to do, and she says, well, revive him. So Dyson says, okay, fine, I will go, I'll do my best to get them. And he does. He gets 4 small bottles of chloroform. He comes back and he gives them to Adelaide. Now what she does is she puts a few sprinkles on a handkerchief, and when Edwin is in the most pain with his stomach or his mouth, she waves the hanky in front of him and it seems to revive him for a few minutes. Remember I said Edwin was into all this magnetism and that later became hypnotism? Well, it's not really clear, but there might have been a few occasions where Adelaide dabbled in chloroform into hypnotism in the couple's bedroom. That might have been something that was going on between them. And all the time this is happening, they're still in this relationship triangle with Dyson. Now, after a few months of her putting it on a handkerchief and waving it in front of his face, Edwin begins to feel better. Slowly, really slowly at first, but eventually he's back up on his feet. It looks very much like his health is on the mend. Great news. Adelaide's delighted, so is Dyson. The 3 of them can continue this relationship and everything will be okay. It was New Year. And on this New Year's Eve, Edwin and Adelaide have decided to spend it at home alone. Edwin had been at work all day. They had eaten themselves a large dinner and they'd gone to bed around 11:30. Just before going to bed, Edwin announces to the housekeeper, as tomorrow is New Year's Day, I would like a large haddock for breakfast. So off they go to bed, the house falls silent, and then at 4 a.m, Adelaide makes a panicked phone call to the housekeeper, asking her to fetch the doctor as soon as possible, followed by the words, Edwin is dead. When Dr. Leach, the crazy dentist, arrives at the home, he sees Adelaide in the bedroom standing near the body, and Edwin, indeed, is dead in his bed. Immediately, she sends a telegram to Edwin Sr. saying only the words, Edwin is dead, please come at once. Now, Edwin Sr.'s recollection of arriving at the house the following day goes like this. I do not remember who I saw at the house. I remember Adelaide said the words to me, "Edwin is dead." I saw my son lying on the couch. I went and I kissed him and I smelt his mouth. I thought he might have been poisoned with prussic acid, and I smelt it to find out. And I did not detect any smell of that kind. I did not kiss his mouth, I kissed his forehead. Dr. Leach was there and I said, "We must have a post-mortem. This cannot pass." I don't think I saw anyone except Adelaide and Dr. Leach. But I can't say for sure. I was dreadfully cut up seeing my son lying dead in a manner so unexpected. Now, this suggestion of post-mortem, how do you think Adelaide feels about this? Well, she is in complete agreement. She wants this. She wants as much as anyone to know what has killed Edwin. Her story is that they fell asleep at 11:30. She woke at 4 a.m. and noticed that she couldn't hear him breathing and that he felt cold. And that was her first sign that something was wrong. So in the days after his death, as the post-mortem is being prepared, Dyson comes to visit, and one of the questions he has is this: "What did you do with the chloroform that I gave you?" Adelaide answers, "Do not mention my name in relation to chloroform, and I won't mention yours either." So very much a sort of threat there from Adelaide. She adds, "If you speak of it again, you will have the whole bloody town believing I poisoned them." Well, I'm afraid it's too late for Adelaide, because that's what everybody already thinks anyway. Before Edwin is even had his post-mortem, had a funeral, people have already cast her in the role of cruel murderess. Stories of the threesome begin to emerge, and of course, as people do and people will, they put two and two together and decide that this is a Dyson and Adelaide conspiracy to kill Edwin, get his money, and run off together. Of course, they both deny this. The only fact that people can grasp onto, the only bit of information that's come out of the bedroom, is that there happened to be a brandy glass near Edwin's side of the bed, and that the doctor thought he smelled something from the glass that wasn't brandy, but he couldn't say for sure. It was chloroform, couldn't say what it was, but there was an odd smell. Now people will say, well, Edwin didn't drink, he didn't touch alcohol, so that's weird. And Adelaide says, well, on this particular night he decided he did want a brandy, as it was New Year. Dyson returns the next day, and they have a whispered conversation in the house, not knowing that the housekeeper is listening. "Don't ask me again about the chloroform." She then stamps her foot at Dyson and says, "No more mention of it." So, here's the thing, right? This could be a classic tale of wife poisons husband, couldn't it? But then I wouldn't have picked it if it was just your traditional classic story like this. There has to be something which makes it different. And it's this. The post-mortem is done on Edwin, and this is what's discovered. His stomach is full of chloroform. However, there are absolutely no signs of it on his throat, his mouth, or his lips. His stomach is somehow full of it, but yet it hasn't passed through his system. So how in hell's bells did it get there? This really puzzles the pathologists, or whatever they were called back then. This seems insane to them. They're like, it's in his body, but it hasn't passed down his throat. There's not a single sign of it in his mouth. What the fuck? And there would have been. Chloroform doesn't hide anywhere. You cannot hide that liquid. So how in the hell did it get into his stomach? So after hearing that this is the result of the post-mortem, Dyson comes to Adelaide one more time and he says to her, I'm going to the police. He says, I'm going to admit that I bought 4 bottles of it across London and that you asked me to. And she says, don't you dare. They will imprison me for life if you tell them that. And he says, I have to. 2 days later, Adelaide Bartlett is arrested for murder. Now you can imagine what Edwin Sr. had to say about this. He revelled in this. He was like, I told you all from the beginning she was trouble. I knew from the start, and now she's gone and killed my son. The public opinion of Adelaide is absolutely awful. I mean, she's called a harlot, a murderer, a temptress. What people think the story of this 3 people in a marriage thing is exposed. And through all of it, it's still not possible to explain how the contents got into his stomach. Now, this is the one and the only time in her adult life that her father, the man who raised her, do you remember William Wellbeloved, who arranged her marriage from France? It's the one and only time he will ever pop up. And he does that to provide a lot of money so that she can hire a good lawyer. For him, having an illegitimate child who is now a murderer is not a good look. So he just throws lots of cash at it. So the courts, of course, they're full of busybodies and gossips who can't wait to see Adelaide go to prison. And the trial begins. Edwin Sr. is the first to testify against her and explain his misgivings. He talks about the earlier affair with the brother, the letters telling him to stay away, moving house so that he would be cut out of their lives, and her refusal to get a doctor. And none of this looks good for Adelaide. Dyson is next to testify, and he's made to explain the whole love triangle. And he tells the court that often what would happen is Edwin would ask Dyson to kiss Adelaide in his presence, and that Edwin liked to see his wife be kissed by another man. Now, hearing all of this, the jury are like, this is a bit more complicated than we first thought. The next to testify is Dr. Leach, the crazy dentist. And what he brings to the situation just confuses things even more. He says that Edwin talked often of death and told him that I won't be here in a year. This thing inside me is going to kill me. He described that Edwin was in such pain and so delirious at times that he said death would be a relief. And so when asked, does the doctor think Edwin could have taken his own life, he says, I do think it's possible, yeah. The other thing that Edwin had said to the doctor was, at least I know that when I go, my sweet Adelaide will be with Minister Dyson, her real love. The housekeeper testifies that she once thought that she witnessed hypnotisms going on in the bedroom and that Adelaide had hypnotised Edwin. So what these 4 people bring to the courtroom just creates a really odd picture. Dr. Leach is cross-examined again about the possibility of suicide. He says it's a very, very, very small possibility that Edwin could have taken a glass of chloroform, knocked it back so quickly that it didn't touch his mouth, but it's really highly unlikely because there's going to be traces of it. But now Adelaide's defence have got something to work with. That at least the possibility of suicide is up in the air. The hypnosis theory, well, it works in the favour of the prosecution, who claim that she hypnotised them and that she somehow managed to tip it down his throat without it showing in his throat. It doesn't really land. What's interesting is by now the medical community are starting to pay attention. This has got everyone scratching their heads. Very, very experienced doctors from all across the UK are looking at this and going, how is this possible? How is it in his stomach and yet there's no trace of it in the top half of his body? During the trial, the idea of her being this harlot, this temptress, begins to change, and people start to wonder, was Adelaide perhaps a pawn between these two men? Was actually she not really always in control of this relationship as it's been painted? Minister Dyson, actually, he goes from being questioned about his potential role in the death to that of character witness for Adelaide. On the defence side of things, saying actually she loved Edwin very, very much. And the housekeeper backs this up by saying Adelaide would stay awake for hours, poring over medical books looking for cures. She deeply loved Edwin and she didn't want him to be ill. Now, the one person not allowed to speak in the whole trial is Adelaide. People charged with murder at this time weren't allowed to take part in their own case. They just had to sit there and listen. So for 6 weeks, this case lasts, and every bit of their life is exposed. During this time, there is such a fascination with the story because of the circumstances, and this is the last time I will say it, I promise. How did it get into his stomach without touching his mouth or his throat? The jury retire to decide upon their verdict, and they return not guilty. Adelaide Bartlett is a free woman. The jury just couldn't find the evidence in those 6 weeks to prove that she'd done it. After the trial was finished, Edwin Sr. stripped Adelaide of any money, possessions, belongings, anything relating to Edwin, and she was left with very little. Public interest in her was at such a fever that she had to hide out in different houses around London to avoid the interest in her. Minister Dyson, he gives up his house in London and he moves to Australia. As far as we know, he never saw Adelaide ever again. The medical community are left still scratching their heads, looking at this case, not understanding it. And Adelaide Bartlett, what of her? Well, she left London not long after, and there were never any more reported sightings of her. Speculation grew that she'd gone back to France. Some say she lived out her days in Scotland. Others say that she killed herself shortly after the trial, but they're all guesses because nobody knows where Adelaide Bartlett went. There's 2 things in this case that we will never know the answers to. How it got into his stomach and where Adelaide Bartlett went after the trial. I'll finish with what one of the doctors watching this trial with fascination said when it was all over. Now that she's been acquitted for murder and cannot be tried again, she really needs to tell us, in the interest of science, how the hell she did it. And so ends the story. Alright then, well, there you go. If you want more on that, you can. It's called the Pimlico Mystery, because Pimlico was the bit of London that they lived in, so often goes by the name the Pimlico Mystery. And honestly, the books that have been written about this, the blogs, the endless hours of videos that you'll find about this case, because it's quite confusing. Anyway, that's it. That's this episode. I am out of here. As always, get me on the social medias. Hit me up for more Princess Diana impressions if you want them, because that was obviously so good. I'm available to do all the royal family members, should you wish. And yeah, until we speak again, okay, goodbye.
It didn't affect me really one way or the other. I would imagine from the look on his face, let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over. Let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over.